The bar never really leaves. It just waits for the water to forget it. That's what Desmond Okafor's uncle used to say, standing on the bow of the mullet boat in the gray light before the channel markers were even visible, watching the way the swells broke differently in certain places than in others. He said a man could read 100 years of history.
These notebooks from the
in the way
tackle
a
box
wave
document
decided
years
to
of
curl.
local
The
observations.
water
Thank you. We'll review that
always
alongside our
remembered
data.
what was underneath it. Even after the bottom had been buried so long that the charts forgot to mention it, Desmond was 70 years old. He had been reading that water since he was 14. He'd crewed mullet boats with his uncle Cyrus through his teenage years on the Florida panhandle, learning the entrance channel the way you learn a person's face, not by measuring it, but by noticing it day after day, until the noticing became something closer to knowing. Cyrus had never married, never had children of his own, and Desmond had always understood, without either of them ever saying it directly, that the boy was being handed something, not just a trade, but a way of paying attention that Cyrus had inherited from his own father and didn't want to see disappear. Desmond had run charter fishing trips out of the same arena for 39 years since, taking tourists and locals out past the jetties into Gulf, threading the same Channel 6, 8, sometimes 10 times a day in season. The channel had a personality. Most channels did, if you paid attention long enough. This one had a particular habit at certain tide stages, a way the swells would roll smooth and unbroken across most of the entrance, except at one specific spot near the eastern edge, where they would peak up sharper than they should, break a half-second earlier than the water around them, then settle back down. Cyrus had pointed out to Desmond on his very first trip, before Desmond even understood what he was looking at. "That's old," Cyrus had said. "Older than the channel, older than the jetties, older than any of us." Desmond had asked what was under there. Cyrus had said he didn't know exactly, but he kept a notebook about it anyway, because his own father had kept one before him, a man who'd worked these waters back when the channel was still mostly natural, before the Army Corps had dredged it straight in the 1920s. Bar conditions. The notebooks were labeled. 3 of them, Cyrus's in a tight, careful hand, sitting now in a metal tackle box under Desmond's helm alongside the 2 volumes he'd added himself over 39 years. He still wrote in one every season. It wasn't a habit he'd ever had to think about maintaining. It was simply part of how a season ended, the way you cleaned the boat or settled accounts with a bait shop. You wrote down what the water had done. The change started small enough that Desmond almost didn't notice it as a change at all. For most of his life, that eastern peak in the swells had been consistent, predictable in its inconsistency. You might say a known quirk that didn't mean much beyond being a thing he pointed out to curious passengers. But 4 years ago, on an ordinary October afternoon with a moderate groundswell running, Desmond noticed the peak was sharper than usual. Not by a lot, but enough that he mentioned it to his first mate, a young man named Pruitt, who'd been running with him 3 seasons and had a good eye. Pruitt hadn't noticed anything. To him, it looked like every other day on the water. Desmond wrote it down anyway. He'd learned from Cyrus that the things worth writing down weren't always the things that seemed important yet. They were the things that felt slightly off from what you expected, even when you couldn't say exactly why. The following spring, the peak was sharper still, and it had widened, not just 1 point breaking early, but a stretch maybe 40 yards across, all peaking at roughly the same tide stage, all breaking with that same half-second early sharpness that Cyrus had first shown him decades before. Desmond pulled out Cyrus's old notebooks that winter and read through them carefully, looking for any mention of the eastern peak changing over time. There wasn't much, a few scattered references across 30 years, all describing it as stable, a fixed feature of the entrance that didn't grow or shrink, just sat there being itself. That was the part that bothered him. Cyrus's record showed decades of stability. What Desmond was seeing now was movement. He didn't know what it meant yet. A feature that had been fixed for 60 years didn't simply start changing for no reason. Something underneath it had to be moving, shifting, settling, or being uncovered by something the surface gave no other indication of. But knowing that a change had a cause and knowing what that cause was were 2 very different things, and Desmond had learned a long time ago not to confuse the 2. He kept watching. The county newspaper ran the announcement in late winter. The Port Authority, in partnership with a cruise line consortium, had secured funding to deepen and widen the entrance channel, part of a broader redevelopment of the historic waterfront to accommodate a new cruise terminal. Bigger ships needed more water under the keel and more room to maneuver. The project would widen the channel's eastern margin by nearly 60 feet to create the turning basin the larger vessels required. Desmond read the article twice, then drove down a marina and stood looking at the water for a long time. The eastern margin, the exact stretch where the swells had been changing. He thought about what Cyrus used to say, that the water remembered things even after they were buried. He thought about his own 4 years of notes showing a stable feature suddenly beginning to shift. He didn't have proof of anything. He had a pattern and a feeling and 3 generations of notebooks that said the eastern edge of this channel had never behaved quite like the rest of it. He decided to go to the scoping meeting. The meeting was held in a county building downtown, the kind of room with fluorescent lighting and folding tables that made every conversation feel a little more official than it probably needed to be. There were maybe 30 people there, a mix of marina operators, environmental advocates, and curious residents. Desmond brought the tackle box. When the public comment period opened, he stood up and explained what he'd been seeing, the way the swells had been changing at the eastern edge over 4 seasons, the contrast with Cyrus's decades of stable observations before that, his sense that something beneath the sediment might be shifting or rising in that specific zone. The project's lead dredge engineer, a measured man named Castellano, listened politely and then explained that the channel's recent multibeam sonar survey, high resolution, professionally conducted, state-of-the-art, showed uniform soft sediment to design depth across the entire proposed widening zone. No hard features, no anomalies, nothing that would complicate the dredging. Wave behavior can be deceiving, Castellano said. Lots of things can make a wave peak differently. Wind, swell direction, even boat wakes. Sonar doesn't lie. Desmond didn't have a counter for that. He wasn't an engineer. He had 40-some years on the water, and a feeling that wouldn't leave him alone, and neither of those things carried the same weight as a multi-beam survey in a room like this. He thanked Castellano and sat back down. He wasn't angry, exactly. Castellano hadn't been dismissive. He'd been precise, professional, citing the kind of evidence a room like that was built to respect. Desmond understood the asymmetry of the situation well enough. A multi-beam survey produced a printable report with depth contours and confidence intervals. A man's memory of how a wave used to break produced nothing you could put in a binder. He didn't stop watching, though. That wasn't really a decision he made. It was just what he did, the way he'd always done it, the way Cyrus had done it before him. Through that summer and into fall, as the dredging contract were finalized and the equipment began arriving at the marina, Desmond kept running his charters and kept noting the eastern peak every time he crossed it. It kept changing. By autumn, the peak had widened to nearly 70 yards, and a half-second early break had become almost a full second early in places. Distinct enough now that even Pruitt noticed it without being told. "That's not normal, is it?" Pruitt said one afternoon, watching the swell curl sharp and sudden where it had once rolled smooth, the break audible now in a way it hadn't been even a year before. "No," Desmond said, "it's not." Pruitt asked if he was going to say something to the port people. Desmond didn't answer right away. He watched the water settle back down behind the boat's wake before he finally said he wasn't sure yet what there was to say that they hadn't already decided not to hear. He thought about going back to the Port Authority. He hesitated. He told himself he might be wrong. That Castellano's survey was recent and precise, conducted with instruments far more sophisticated than anything Cyrus had ever had access to, and that maybe what Desmond was reading as a geological feature was something else entirely. A current shift, a subtle change in the prevailing swell direction that season. He'd been wrong about things before once, years back. He'd been certain a school of redfish had relocated permanently to a different flat, only to watch them return to their old grounds the following spring like nothing had happened. The water didn't always mean what you thought it meant. He decided to wait and watch one more season before saying anything else. It was the kind of patience Cyrus had taught him without ever calling it patience. The understanding that the water would eventually make its case more clearly than Desmond could make it for them, if he was willing to keep watching long enough to let it. The dredging began in January. 2 cutterhead dredges working in tandem, methodically widening the channel according to the approved plans. moving sediment to a disposal site offshore. For the first several weeks, the work proceeded without incident, exactly as projected. In early February, on a Tuesday morning, one of the cutterheads struck something hard. The impact was significant enough to damage the cutting teeth and halt operations on that dredge for inspection. The contractor's initial assessment, reported in the local paper, attributed the strike to submerged debris, not an unreasonable conclusion, given that the area had a known history of small craft wrecks dating back decades, remnants of storms and forgotten anchorages scattered along the entrance. Work resumed within the week. The dredge rerouted slightly around the obstruction rather than through it, and the project continued without further incident through the spring. Desmond read the news coverage and said nothing publicly. He thought about calling Castellano's office, about pointing out that the strike had happened in roughly the same zone where the swells had been changing for 4 years. But he had no proof that the two things were connected, only a feeling, and feelings hadn't moved anyone in that fluorescent-lit room the previous winter. He pulled out his notebooks instead and wrote a long entry that night, the longest he'd written in years, describing everything: the swells, the meeting, the strike, the rerouting, in case it ever mattered to anyone the way Cyrus's notes had once seemed like they might never matter to anyone at all. The channel was completed in early summer, on schedule. The new turning basin opened with appropriate ceremony. Local officials photographed shaking hands in front of first cruise ship to call it the redeveloped terminal. Desmond watched the coverage on the local news from his living room and didn't say much. For 3 months, everything was fine. Then came an unusual confluence of conditions in early September. An especially low spring tide combined with a moderate swell event pushing in from a tropical system passing well offshore. Desmond happened to be running a charter that morning, threading the channel just after dawn when he saw it. The eastern edge of the new turning basin, the exact zone where the dredge had struck something hard back in February, was exposed, not fully above water, but close enough. The bar's crest visible just beneath the surface where a sharp, breaking peak rose unmistakably out of water that the new channel design assumed was uniformly deep. It hadn't been there in the old channel alignment. It was there now, sitting directly in the path larger vessels would take to the widened turning basin. 3 days later, a container vessel under harbor pilot control, transiting the channel during a similarly low tide, came within what the subsequent incident report described as an extremely narrow margin of grounding on the same feature. The pilot, an experienced harbor pilot named Reyes, reported feeling an unusual drag to the helm before adjusting course, narrowly avoiding what could have been a catastrophic grounding for a fully loaded vessel. Reyes had transited that channel hundreds of times in his career and said afterward, in the incident report, that nothing in his training or his charts had prepared him for water behaving that way in a zone the survey had certified as clear. The channel was closed for emergency assessment within the hour. The investigation that followed brought in a coastal geologist named Dr. Anwin Price, contracted by the Port Authority to determine what exactly had been struck back in February and what was now intermittently exposed at low tide. She ran a new high-resolution survey of the eastern turning basin, this time specifically probing beneath the surface sediment layer, rather than simply mapping the bottom as it currently appeared. What she found was not debris. It was bedrock, a hard, elevated geological feature running diagonally across the eastern margin, sitting just beneath what had been, until recently, a thin and apparently temporary covering of soft sediment. The dredging itself, in removing the surrounding looser material, had stripped away cover that had been masking the feature, exposing more of its crest than had ever been visible in living memory. Dr. Price asked the obvious question. Had anyone documented this feature before? Desmond brought in the tackle box. She spent 2 full days at Desmond's kitchen table going through Cyrus's notebooks, then Desmond's own, then making careful notes of her own as the pattern emerged across nearly 60 years of recorded observations. Decades of stability, followed by 4 years of progressive change that exactly preceded the dredge strike. Desmond made coffee both mornings and mostly sat across from her in silence, answering her questions when she had them, watching her read his uncle's handwriting with the same careful attention Cyrus himself used to bring to the water. "This is remarkable," she said more than once, turning the pages carefully. "Nobody surveys for this. You don't put instruments out looking for something nobody's told you might be there." It was Desmond who remembered, almost as an afterthought, Something Cyrus had mentioned once, years before he died, a story about a second channel, some old configuration from before his own father's time, something the old-timers used to talk about but nobody had ever bothered writing down properly. Desmond hadn't thought about it in years. He mentioned it to Dr. Price mostly out of habit, the way you mention something that seems unlikely to matter. She took it seriously enough to dig into the regional archive. It took her research assistant the better part of a month, working through poorly indexed boxes in a county records facility that hadn't been properly cataloged since the 1970s, before they found it. A 1923 Army Corps of Engineers survey, conducted before the original channel dredging, documenting the natural inlet configuration as it existed prior to modification. The survey itself was a fragile, hand-annotated document, the kind of thing that had survived a century mostly by accident, misfiled in a folder marked for an entirely different stretch of coastline, overlooked by at least 2 prior digitization efforts that had judged it not worth the time. The survey had never been digitized. It had simply been filed and forgotten, one of hundreds of similar documents from a century of coastal engineering work nobody thought worth revisiting. The 1923 chart showed an older inlet alignment, curving where the modern channel ran straight, passing directly through what was now the eastern turning basin. It was the bar, the same one. It had never disappeared. The 1920s dredging had simply buried it under redirected sediment, and a century of relatively stable conditions had kept it buried, until the new dredging, combined with whatever subtle current shifts had begun stripping cover in the years before, exposed again. The channel hadn't forgotten the bar. It had only been waiting for someone to stop covering it up. The remediation took the better part of a year. The Port Authority, working with Dr. Price's team, redesigned the eastern margin of the turning basin to route around the bedrock feature rather than through it, a more conservative alignment that sacrificed some of the originally planned turning radius but eliminated the hazard. It cost considerably more than the original plan, and it delayed full cruise terminal operations by several months. Desmond didn't take any particular satisfaction in being right. Mostly what he felt, watching the new survey markers going around the feature his uncle had first pointed out to him 56 years earlier, was something closer to grief. For Cyrus, who'd kept those notebooks for 30 years believing nobody would ever care what they said, who died 9 years ago in a nursing home 2 counties over, the boats and the channel, and most of what he'd known about the water already slipping past him by then, never imagining his careful, patient observations about a wave pattern would someday matter to a federal investigation. Dr. Price's final report included an appendix documenting the historical observation record that had ultimately led to the discovery. She listed Cyrus Okafor's notebooks, 1961 to 1991, and Desmond Okafor's continuation, 1992 to the present, as the only documented baseline establishing the bar's prior stability and its recent reemergence. 60 years of data that no formal survey program had ever thought to commission, because nobody officially charged with monitoring the channel had known there was anything there worth monitoring. Desmond stood at the marina that winter, the new channel markers reflecting cold light off water that was, for the moment, behaving the way water should. He thought about his uncle's voice from 56 years ago. That's old, older than any of us, and about how long something could wait quietly beneath a century of accumulated sediment for someone to notice it was still there. He went home and pulled out his current notebook. He wrote the date. He wrote the tide stage. He wrote a description of the eastern margin. Calm now. The bar properly charted. The channel routed safely around it. Then he added one more line. The kind of line Cyrus might have written, the kind that didn't seem important yet, but felt like it might be, someday, to somebody. Channel's quiet tonight, but it's still down there. It always was. He closed the notebook and set it back in the tackle box, beside Cyrus's, where it belonged.